We have gathered here to attend the fourth lecture in the webinar series conducted by AKPCTA on NEP 2020. The Academic Committee of the organization decided to conduct this webinar series because it shares certain serious apprehensions about the proposals in the NEP. This webinar series was inaugurated by Professor Keshav Bhattacharya, President IFACTO, on 7th September. And during the inaugural session, Dr. K.P. Rajesh, Assistant Professor, TIS Hyderabad campus, delivered the keynote address on the idea of multidisciplinarity and national education policy, reality beyond pretensions. The second lecture was delivered by Professor Arun Kumar, Malcolm Adisheshaya Chair, Chairperson of Malcolm Adisheshaya Chair, Institute of Social Sciences, New Delhi. His topic was New Education Policy, does it meet the challenge of knowledge generation? The third lecture was on NEP and equity concern by Dr. Ishida Mukhopadhyaya, Department of Economics, University of Calcutta. Today's session is jointly organized by the Women's Committee and Academic Subcommittee of AKPCTA, and the resource person is Dr. Archana Prasad. She is Professor, Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies, JNU, New Delhi. And the topic is Women, Education and Equality. So it's time for us to begin the session today. For proposing the formal welcome, let me invite Professor Shajida S., Convener, State Women's Committee, AKPCTA. Shajida?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Good evening to all. Most respected Dr. Archana Prasad and respected leaders of AKPCTA, moderator, and dear participants of this event. It's my privilege and pleasure on behalf of All Kerala Private College Teachers Association to welcome you here today. As we all know, we are here in this online platform to hear from a learned professor on a relevant topic, women, equality, and education. We know India accounts for 30% of the world's illiterate population, and 70 of these illiterates are women. Problems of gender disparity and discrimination begin with access to schooling. A disproportionate number of the nearly 12 million Indian children not in school are female. The disparity in education between boys and girls is clearly visible in India's literacy rates. 82% boys are literate, 65% of girls only can read and write according to census data of 2011. India's new educational policy 2020, which the government has said is geared towards the demands of the 21st century, might be, in fact, be a setback for girls' education. Despite some progressive provisions in the policy, such as a gender inclusion fund towards equitable education for girls as well as transgender students, and a substantial increase in public investment to bring education spending to 6% of gross domestic product, there are growing concerns about implications on girls' education. With this, there are concerns that many schools will become privatized and no longer will be free and accessible to all. Low-income families will not be able to afford school fees, which may impact girls more. It is in this background that the present lecture becomes highly relevant. With these words, let me enter into the duty bestowed upon me, that is welcoming the most respected dignitaries and dear participants. We are fortunate in getting the most deserving person to deliver the lecture on women, equality, and education. That is none other than Dr. Archana Prasad, Professor, Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. We are really happy to get the service of the learned scholar for sharing her thoughts with us, and we are extremely thankful to you, ma'am, for the magnanimity you have shown towards us by accepting our invitation. Dear fellow members and participants, please join me in giving our chief guest the best cordial welcome. Welcome you, ma'am. As a
Thank
matter of
you.
formality, I welcome today's moderator, uh, Bindu teacher, and I welcome the leaders of AKPCTA, Padmanabhan sir, Georgie sir, Olina teacher, Sheila teacher, Sri Kumar sir, Lakshmi Priya, and all academic committee team, as well as all participants. Once again, I welcome all of you. Thank you. Over to Bindu teacher. Bindu teacher.
Yeah, thank you, Shagida. Now let me invite Dr. Sheila M. Joseph, Vice President AKPCTA and Chairperson State Women's Committee, to make her introductory remarks. Dr. Sheila.
Okay. Respected resource person of this section, Dr. Archana Prasad, moderator, Dr. R. Bintu, respected President of AKPCTA, Professor Georgie Alec, Honorable Secretary, Dr. C. Padmanabhan, Women's Health Convener, Professor Shajita, Academic Committee Convener, Dr. Lakshmi Priya, Member of Academic Committee, Professor Emmanuel, and dear friends. The new education policy, which replaces the former 1986 policy, was introduced with a big bang by the central government, stating that this policy addresses the major problems existing in the present educational system and advocates that it will eradicate all the drawbacks of the earlier policy. As the chairperson of State Women's Committee of All Kerala Private College Teachers Association, I take this opportunity to point out the major flaws about the new NEP. After the independence of India in 1947, the Indian women were trying too hard to find a place in Indian society. Education was their weapon and education was their path. There are major drawbacks in the present education system. Historically, school curriculum have remained silent on discrimination based on sexual identification and orientation of individuals and specified discrimination that transgender individuals face in workspaces. The new education policy remains silent and does not outline how it plans to increase the enrollment of transgender individuals, nor does it convey ways to solve discrimination faced by them in educational institutions. Another major point which I would love to point out is the perspective of the central government on equality. The Minister for Environment, Forest and Climate Change, in his message, which I quote that, to eliminate the shortage of manpower in science, technology, academics, and industry. This terminology used by the Union Minister renders women and those with gender fluid identities invisible and irrelevant in terms of what are considered to be important domains in society. The NEP highlights women and mothers are expected to provide the majority of those who work to improve literacy and numeracy skills. This concern for recruiting female students is found out up to school level, but evaporates as we move higher up the educational hierarchy. Sadly, while women's studies and gender studies are among the most exciting and challenging interdisciplinary fields to have emerged in recent decades. These find no mention. NEP 2020 introduces many innovative ideas, but fails to address the major problems existing now. It fails to address women equality and the widespread discrimination in educational sector. It is our duty to question and protest against the NEP, where women are almost neglected. Hoping our protest will not go in vain. I thank everyone present here for lending me a few minutes of your time to hear me. Thank you. Over to Bindu teacher.
Thank you, Sheila teacher. Dear friends, as I have told you earlier, the fourth lecture in the webinar series conducted by AKPCTA on NEP is on women, equality and education. And the resource person is Dr. Archana Prasad, Professor, Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies, JNU. As you all know, AKPCTA, as a responsible teachers organization committed to the causes of safeguarding the democratic principles and secular values of education, decided to organize the webinar series as it is acutely aware of the serious repercussions which may result from the present NEP. This policy document can very well be called as a manifesto of politics of exclusion. If we pay attention to the purposeful absences, silences, gaps, and contradictions implicit in the document, we can easily trace chances of significant erosion of the democratic values and the subsequent systematic erasure or displacement of the subaltern classes, sections, and gender altogether from the field of education. As far as women are concerned, they are positioned at the lowest pedestal of the power pyramid in Indian society, which is highly hierarchical or pyramidal in nature. There is a wide gender gap existing in our society in all spheres of life. It is women who enter the field of education lastly, and there are chances for them being ousted first if the politics of exclusion implicit in NEP works out as per its proposals. Dr. Archana Prasad will be dwelling on the minute details of such a crisis, such a possibility. I request Dr. Archana Prasad to deliver her lecture. She has been working on gender issues related to gender justice for a long time, and she is member of the Central Committee of All India Democratic Women's Association. I once again welcome her to the platform and invite her to deliver her talk. Thank you.
Mm, can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay.
You are audible.
Dr. Bindu, Dr. Sujita, Dr. Sheila, and all the esteemed members of the All Kerala College Teachers Association, Private College Teachers Association. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you for inviting me to deliver this fourth lecture of the National Lecture Series on National Education Policy 2020. I'm particularly happy to talk to you because this is the first time I'm talking to. This is possibly the first time that I'm addressing, even though online, association of college teachers who are working in private aided colleges. As you know, and I don't need to tell you this, 72% of all undergraduate students and 60% of overgraduate students are actually in private affiliated colleges to different universities. And therefore, the act of organizing and sensitizing those teachers to the issues of the democratic movement and of the women's movement is indeed a very, very important one. And therefore, I congratulate you for making such an organization and making it survive for the last 5 decades in a manner that it raises issues amongst college teachers that have an impact on the larger progressive politics of the country. So with that, I'd like to now begin with shedding some light on this topic, women, equality, and education. But before I do that, I just want to make a broad claim, which I'll try to sort of substantiate in this lecture. My broad claim is thus: from the 1970s and the 1980s, the women's movement has been fighting for the rights of women, and it won many battles and many concessions. In fact, many of its rights were enshrined in law. For example, the Domestic Violence Act, for example, the enactment of 498A, for example, the enactment of the Right to Education Act, and many other such things, or the MNREGS, the Right to Employment, Rural Employment Act. All these things are things that the women's movement has been fighting for. At the same time, the women's movement was fighting for the transformation of social structures within the society, whether took up issues of domestic violence as a public campaign, basically saying that the oppression of women at home is not a private issue. It's a public issue that needs to be addressed, whether opposing the caste panchayats in North India or the practice of dowry. I know people in Kerala may not be so excited by this, but the advances achieved in many regions in gathering women to question old social practices and patriarchy itself was something that was born out of a very, very long, drawn-out struggle, starting from the freedom struggle, but what we call in the new phase of the women's movement as 70s and 80s. And right from the beginning of the early 90s, the attacks on this movement have started, but especially in the last 6 or 7 years, or I would say maybe from the time of the resurgence of the Hindutva movement under the guise of the BJP and the RSS, this movement has been under tremendous attack. And what we are today experiencing, for example, you have a Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, and for women you have a Swayam Sevika Sangh. So the men's movement is a self-help movement, but a woman's movement is conceived as one that is laboring for others, whether it's in paid work or unpaid work. And the entire idea of a pure, beautiful wife, a traditional family, all these things you can get from the website of the Rashtriya Swayam Sevika Sangh. The very fact that you do not really have a RSS organization, which is, so to say, a co-educational organization, is itself, I mean, a co-ed organization, men and women can work together as comrades, is itself instructive of the mindset. And this mindset even justifies honor killings, caste panchayats, a lot of marital rape and violence, and all these other kinds of things. So the idea that you are going to promote this idea of the nation is based on such a gender inequitous culture, majoritarian culture, is itself the beginning, or is itself signifier or a marker of the intensification of the project of a social counter-revolution, where issues like love jihad, issues like what women should wear, if a woman gets raped, it's her fault because of the clothes that she's wearing. You see, these are some things, public things, that have got sort of become contested terrains. But today, we are again finding that that contestation is being stopped. Not that women are not trying, but it is being stopped largely because of the violence associated with the imposition of a majoritarian culture, one of whose basic pillars is the oppression of women, or the confinement of women in their families. And from that point of view, you know, when we look at both education, and employment, we find that many reversals have taken place. Today, if you take employment, after all, the NEP, one of its objectives is to make employable people. But if you take employment, we have a historic high unemployment rate of 6.1 for both men and women. And the women's worker population ratio is the lowest in 6 decades. But still, the ideological position of our government is that we are creating flexible work conditions. We are going to enskill people through the education system that we are wanting. So the point that I'm trying to make is that the social counter-revolution, to use Prabhat Patnaik's term, that is taking place in all spheres of life, has the rights of women at its particular target, and the women are fighting to defend their own rights. And the right to education for women is one such right that is under the attack under the National Education Policy. Now, before I get into the difference between this education policy in terms of its idea of equality and the 1986 National Education Policy, I just gathered a few I was myself surprised, a few very interesting facts about gender gaps, which I've got from the NSSO's Education Survey 14-15 and 2017-18. Now, if we look at the gender gap between people who are from the years of 5 to 29, who are currently attending all educational, any educational institution, you find something very interesting. In 2008, the gap between men and women was 3.1%. In 2014, it was 5.7%. And in 2018, at all levels of education, it is 6.4. It is 6.4%. So we find that in fact, in terms of those attending any educational institution from the age of 5 and to 29, which is considered the age for education, the gender gap overall has in fact increased, even though between 14 and 18, it may only have increased marginally. That's number one. Number two, this is for the rural areas, sorry. This is for the rural areas. In the urban areas, the gender gap is still quite high. It was 2.4 in 2008. In 2014, it's 3.6. And in 2018, it became 5.3. So between 14 and 18, even in the so-called urban areas, where access is meant to have improved, the gender gap still persists and has in fact widened in the 4 years between 2014-15 and 2017-18. It is true that the gap in those who have never attended an educational institution has come down by almost 10 percentage, by almost 4.8 percentage points between 2008 and 2014. And this is after the enactment of the Right to Education Act. But between 2014, this decline in the rural areas has in fact de-accelerated. The rate of decline has come down from 5.9% to 1%. So we are seeing a reversal, maybe not in terms of negative that should be said, that the educational system of India is very urban-centric. If you look at the entire statistical picture, which is obviously not, it doesn't give you the whole picture, but if you look at many nuances, it misses out. But if you want to get the broad trend, obviously in the urban areas, the differences are lower than the rural areas. And in the rural areas, the differences are widening at a much higher pace. So this urban-centric, male-centric focus of the education system in the post-reforms period should not be underestimated. And this is something that the National Education Policy should have, 2020, should have addressed. Another very interesting statistic I'll give you. I mean, I'm just giving you a stylized statistic which I just made today itself, that if you look at the gender gap, people who have completed secondary education or more, between 5 and 35 years, the gender gap has increased in the rural areas between 2008 and 2018. In 2008, the gender gap in rural areas was 11.4%. In 2014, it became 12.5%. And in 2017-18, it became 13.7%. So the pace of widening gender gap amongst those who have completed education, secondary education or higher, the secondary, high secondary, graduate, diploma, postgraduate, and technical education. This gap has become higher. What is more, in the rural areas too, the pace of the gap is increasing in the urban areas too. So, whereas the gap was 11.7%, 11.4% in 2008. In 2014, it actually came down to 10.6% in the urban areas, and in 2017 it went up again to 11.5%. So there's a reversal taking place here, that people are not completing education. You can say what you like about calculated dropout rates or something, but this is a ballpark figure I'm giving you, that people are not completing education. And one estimate tells us for 2020, this is a UNESCO estimate, that 40 million girl students only have 4 years of education. They only have 4 years of education. So why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you all this because the understanding that gender gaps will automatically disappear if you increase infrastructure and things is not really working out. I don't want to say it's not really true because we have not looked at all the aspects, but it's not really working out. So that's one point that I wanted to make. And we have to evaluate the national education policy from this perspective. If we want to look at women equality, and education. Now, what does equality mean? Equality in education mean as far as educational policy is concerned? If you look at the National Education Policy 1986, it clearly says that equality does not mean merely providing school buildings, colleges, and access to education. Equality means that education has to aim at a process of social engineering. In other words, it should inculcate values of equality, modern values of equality that would, in fact, be anti-patriarchal in its character. With respect to women, page 6 of that policy particularly states that the faith in equality and the process of social engineering can you ask somebody to turn off their video, because they're moving around in their video and it's very disturbing. So they should just turn off the video, otherwise I'm getting distracted.
Is there anybody?
Hello,
Yeah,
hello, Pushpalata baby. Could you
Pushpalata.
please turn off your video? Hello,
She's
Pushpalata.
coming and going and it's distracting.
Hello. It's me, Pushpalata. Please turn off your video, please. Hello.
And Mini Ajay Kumar.
All the participants, please.
Hello, Pushpalata baby. Please turn off your video.
So, so where was I? Yeah. So it specifically states that the question of equality has to be built in terms of values and social engineering. What do you mean by social engineering? It means that schools, colleges, and universities have to be used to break the patriarchal mindset. It specifically states that. Of course, we know that this did not happen and successive regimes did many things. But the point is that we had it on paper that equality means social engineering. The National Education Policy 2020, as was rightly pointed out, the National Education Policy 2020 in fact changes that, because it changes that because it equates access with equality. That you make provisions so that all people can be considered educated. I'm not even saying they become educated. They can be considered educated or considered attending school, and therefore increase the access without really talking about modern values and social engineering. So in one sense, if we look at the two goals of equality, the way they are interpreted in the two education policies, in one sense, the National Education Policy 2020 is a dilution of the National Education Policy 1986, the Kothari Commission report as far as women are concerned. And this itself, I would say, is the first step towards institutionalizing the social counter-revolution which is being waged on us today. The second thing is, if we look at the question, of modernity, the National Education Policy 1986 really talked of modernity in terms of social values, the way in which the socialization of society should be done with respect to secularism, with respect to equality, and all these things. The National Education Policy looks at modernity in an extremely technocratic way. The only place where you talk about modernity is when you're talking about suction platform, permish platform, technological solutions to access and all this. So in one sense, it has a very narrow view of modernity itself, just the same way as it has a very narrow view of education itself. So the point that I'm trying to make is, even in terms of a global vision, of a global perspective of a student or a woman's role within the global economy, the National Education Policy doesn't aim to do that. It doesn't want to do that, the 2020 policy. It wants to take you back to your roots. And the roots are interpreted in terms of the classical Indian culture in which we know how women were treated. So this is the other point that I wanted to make. Now coming to the question of access itself, I want to make 2 points. One is about the character of the access that this education policy provides for. And the second is about financing of the access, especially about women's education. And in both these, I will be, as we already said, pointing towards how it is leading to privatization. But before I do that, I want to again talk to you about the prevailing situation as far as participation of women is concerned in government, private aided, and private unaided institutions. These figures I'm getting from the education survey, the Household Consumption Education Survey 2018. Now, if we look at the gender gaps again, we find that if you look at it from pre-primary to graduate level, in the rural areas, women, the ratio, the gender parity ratio is overwhelmingly in favor of women in government institutions. And if you look at the funding pattern, the scholarships provided for female education and the access to free neighborhood education, this is one of the major factors. Free and compulsory neighborhood education under the RTE. This is one of the major factors for the positive ratio in favor of women in government institutions. In private aided colleges and institutions, in fact, the ratio starts coming down in the negative for women, but it is still not so bad. It is still around, say, 0.5 to about 1.9%. But if you go to private unaided institutions, the gaps are really very high. In pre-primary, 6.6% in rural areas. In primary, 3.1%. In upper primary, where in fact the ratio, even in private aided institutions, was only minus 0.1%. In private unaided institutions, is 2%. And a similar story that you see for urban areas. What does that mean? That basically means that increasing privatization will put education outside the reach of women. Will put education outside the reach of women. And if you look at higher education itself, you know, in central universities, in state public universities, the gap between men and women is maybe 1%. In some courses, women are overwhelmingly outnumbering male students. In private affiliated colleges to state and central universities, 50% are women, 49.6% are men, something like that. The point that I'm trying to tell you is that the importance of a public degree and the hold of government on even private institutions, the regulation, the norms that ensure deprivation points, scholarships, free education, and all kinds of other measures, including quality control, is utmost crucial to the access and participation of women in educational institutions. This is set to change under the National Education Policy 2020. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this for 2 or 3 reasons. Firstly, if you look at the question of access, what is the NEP doing, 2020 doing? It is diluting the standard of what can be called a school. It explicitly states that what can be called a school is too stringent. If it's too stringent, the criteria are too stringent under the RTE, we need to make it more flexible so that more schools can be provided. So what does this mean? This means that you're, in the name of access, you're going to provide second-class education to people who cannot access public formal institutions. So you're not going to expand the infrastructure according to accepted guidelines, but you're going to dilute the guidelines to call something which is not a school or not a college, a school or a college. In other words, what you're doing is you are legitimizing teaching shops. Yeah? And if anything can be called a school near your home, even a one-room hut can be called a school, then it's obvious that in most conditions where there is a crisis of social reproduction, women are going to be sent to second-class schools in the neighborhood rather than to areas with proper schools meeting the minimum qualification. So the solution that the government has found to the dropout rate and all this lack of enrollment is not improving the infrastructure or publicly funding that infrastructure. The solution that it has found is basically to dilute the norms of what we call a school and a college itself. And I can guarantee you, in a society which is today promoting son preference under this Hindutva ideology, which is promoting son preference under this Hindutva ideology, people will say they're educating their girl children, but they will send them to these second-class tutored schools. That's number one. Number two, this higher education, this multiple exit point. This whole question of multiple exit point is going to become really problematic. You know, in abroad land, in Europe, in the developed countries, you have these multiple exit points. But you know, in those multiple exit points, there is two things that are really important. Firstly,
Excuse me, ma'am. Can you adjust your camera? You have gone out of camera.
Yeah, no.
It's okay now, ma'am. It's fine.
It's okay. It's okay.
Yeah. So, so this multiple exit point route, when does it work? I'm not saying that it's essentially bad, but when does it work? It works, number one, where there is no indignity attached to vocational education and manual work or casual work. Yeah, you know, in England, America, and many such places. England, America, and many such places, manual work or technical work is actually far more expensive than many other work. So when there is no indignity attached. Secondly, it works when you can get a diploma and go out and get a job. Well, in the current employment crisis and in the foreseeable future after this COVID shock and all this, we are not seeing a situation where the employment situation is going to improve too much. After all, 4.6 million salaried workers have lost their jobs in this period. 3.9 million women workers have been pushed out of the workforce. So, multiple exit point makes no sense from these two angles. What will happen with multiple exit points? 4 plus 1. First of all, the content of postgraduate education, which is in fact a basic degree for teaching, is going to be diluted. Secondly, those who cannot afford to go to school or those whose parents are having a problem meeting the fees will drop out in the name of multiple exit points. They'll be called educated. So once again, we are not focusing on actually expanding the access. We are creating avenues where half-educated people, where knowledge generation of half the people can where substandard processes of knowledge generation can be called education. So fundamentally, I would say this policy is an anti-education policy, not only for women, but even for everybody else who wants to learn and give back to the society. So that's one thing. The last point that I want to come to, I mean, there's quite a few other things to talk about, but the last important point I want to come to is the question of education. They say they're going to increase the budget to 6% of the GDP, of which GDP? National GDP, state GDP, both of it put together, what? But please read the writing between the lines. Two things are there. First of all, the concept of public aided or public financed education is going to disappear. And I've already shown you that women's education is highly dependent on neighborhood systems where publicly financed education is available. The figures show that. That is going to disappear because gender inclusion fund and whatever research in higher education or whatever fund that is being talked about is going to be dependent on the capacity of the government to mobilize philanthropic funding, that is charity funding. So education becomes charity, and to mobilize private funding. So there's nothing going to be an exclusively public education. They say we are going to expand, and that, like your PM Cares is shown as part of government fund, there's going to be a fund in which all this private money is going to be shown as government fund. So that's one thing. The second thing is the putting on power of private and public education is going to dilute the norms for education itself. You see, because publicly funded education has a certain quality, teaching shops routinely shut up or history. The last point that I want to make, which I did not make and which I don't think anybody else will make, because it's about preschool education, where basically the Anganwadi is going to be now attached to a school. So now, if a woman worker was sending her kid to an Anganwadi in the neighborhood, if your school is 1.8 kilometers away, her distance for sending her kid to preschool will increase. And therefore, even for women workers, it will become less accessible. And finally, we don't know what is going to happen with the Anganwadi workers and the midday meal workers. So the malnutrition, the nutrition part of preschool and primary school education is going to receive a setback. Therefore, I come back to my original argument that the education policy, and I haven't really dwelt enough on the way the Hindutva ideology is going to be promoted. I'm sure others are going to talk about in a lecture series, but the very fact that the classical tradition is going to interpret what is going to be taught as gender education is itself a very dubious exercise. So I come back to my original point and conclude with that the National Education Policy 2020 is the cornerstone, if not the vehicle, for the Sangh Parivar social counter-revolution and for the corporate sector's social counter-revolution. What we see here is the coming together of both of them in order to further attack women's rights. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Archana. Dr. Archana has talked about the gender dimensions of the National Education Policy 2020. It is necessary to sensitize teachers on issues related to democracy. She started from this point, and she reminded us of the struggles which started for gender equality in the 1980s, women's movements battle for equality, which generated many progressive stands like the Domestic Violence Act, the right to education and employment, transformation of social structure, thinking about transformation of social structure, and addressing issues like domestic violence and bridging up the gender gap, etc. And opposing the caste panchayats fight against dowry menace, etc. She referred to all these practices and she referred to the struggles related to question all patriarchal practices, struggles which started from freedom struggle itself, and from the 1990s, attacks started against such progressive struggles. Attacks created by the BJP, RSS, Sangh Parivar sections. The Rashtriya Swayam Sevika Sangh. She referred to the Rashtriya Swayam Sevika Sangh and their regressive ideology related to patriarchy. The concepts of dutiful wife and Bhadralok family concept. Mindset justifying brutal things like honor killing, gender inequitance, reactionary culture, makers of intensification of a social counter revolution. She was speaking about the social counter revolution, a regression caused by the Sangha Parivar sections. What a woman should wear, violence associated with the imposition of majoritarian, communal, and patriarchal values, etc. And how these regressive values should be countered. So we have to build up increasing access to social engineering to change the value system. An attitudinal change should be created. A process of social engineering should be undertaken to correct the value system. Institutionalizing social counter revolution by the Sangh Parivar. How can we counter this counter revolution? And she spoke about question of modernity. She referred to the 1986 document, the policy document, challenges to education. There, the document speaks about modernity related to values of socialization, secularism, equality, etc. But NEP speaks in an exclusively technological view, a very narrow view of education. What is the role of women in a global context? It doesn't address such issues. The present NEP urges to go back to your roots which are very much conservative and reactionary, the traditional model. And she spoke about access, financing, funding for women's education, allocation of funds for women's education, the prevailing situation, participation of women, how it decreased. She, in the beginning of her speech itself, in the beginning of the lecture itself, she brought some statistical evidences, and towards the end, she pointed towards the private unaided institutions, the wide gap between women's participation in governmental institutions and private unaided institutions. Uh, she pointed towards Education Survey 2018. According to this, gender parity ratio in rural area, this is very positive in government institutions, but very negative in private and aided institutions. And in higher education, we can see overwhelmingly wide gender gap. She stressed the importance of regulation, intervention, and control from the part of the government. The present NEP is totally silent about all these things. I think let us start the discussion on this. The floor is open for discussion.
Hi, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for that very interesting session. I'm Swapna, and I wish to point out that you mentioned about the rural-urban divide, which is going to further polarize this nation, which I felt that was so very true. You know, like we have started understanding concept of our nation as being, you know, and citizenship as being the middle class, upper caste Indian identity. And I find that this is also this group that believes that empowering womanhood is all about self-defense techniques and, you know, protecting oneself physically. So as a teacher, I would like to ask you, how do we combat this? How do we tell the students that self defense techniques and physical exercises and becoming stronger is not the way to empower a woman? It is through education. So how do we as teachers cross this barrier, because this is something that you constantly encounter? And I would like to hear what you have to say on this. Thank you.
Dr. Archana has also spoke about the teaching shops, legitimizing teaching shops, the clandestine activity of limiting women's resources by making them mere passive objects using teaching shops, diluting the norms of schools and colleges.
Can I also add to this question, or are we waiting for the answer?
No.
Okay.
Please add. I'll take a few questions together.
Okay. Just a couple of things I would like to hear from you, ma'am, especially because the NEP talks about this very mysterious gender inclusion fund, but it doesn't really specify in detail of what they actually mean to do with that. So I'm wondering what your insights are about whether it means anything at all, or it's just eyewash like everything else that the NEP contains. The second thing, of course, is what you mentioned earlier about this question of access, especially when they talk about modernity in terms of technology. We already know that the access of women to technology, especially even basic smartphones in India, is minimal when you compare it to when you look at the gender divide there. So, I'd like your opinions on that.
Yes.
Ma'am, shall I ask something?
Yes, please.
Thank you, ma'am, for a very nice presentation. I'm Jayashree. As we know, NEP 2020 has a thrust on skill education, and it promotes the multiple entry and exit chances. Could you please say how all this will affect the gender sensitiveness?
I think she has already explained multiple entry, the issue of
I can explain again. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, madam. My name is Anil. I'm teaching economics at Calicut, in a college in Calicut. I have three specific questions, madam. That is, the first one is with regard to the with regard to what you have said about the social counter revolution. So, in that context, the new education policy has evoked the idea of Takshashila and Nalanda, and it has ignored all the modern research findings uh, in modern India. So, all the social revolution values that we have achieved, like the universal adult franchise, the anti-caste movements, the gender equality aspects, etc., are ignored, and they are invoking the ideas of Nalanda and Takshashila as the typical universities in India. So how you see this in the context, in the light of gender equality and education? First one. Secondly, there's a mentioning about 6% of GDP in education in the new education policy, uh, and it's an acceptable idea as far as we are concerned. We are actually arguing for a 6% of GDP in education sector, but the financing of, as you have pointed out, the financing of education, public financing of education is going to be nil, and they are inviting the philanthropic institutions to finance education in our country. How do you think how it will affect the marginalized sections in our country? And thirdly, it's always my doubt that when we are opposing something, we are opposing the privatization of education, we are opposing the commercialization of education, we are saying that it's not possible for, it's not from the point of view of the marginalized sections, from the point of view of the inequality, we should not, the government move to do away from its activities is not desirable, etc. So when we are opposing that, shouldn't we propose something to how to deal with this? How government can fund these social infrastructure like education and health? These are the three questions, and thank you.
Okay. Should I answer? Swapna wants to ask something else.
Yeah.
Should I answer, Bindu? Are there any more questions, or should I answer?
Sure. You can answer. You can start answering.
Okay.
Archana, you can start.
Okay. So, regarding the first question, see, I think, this idea of self-defense becoming integral to women's security is because since the disinvestment in various sort of public programs, the government has tried to promote the policing of security in the sense that you're trying to sell the idea that you can only protect yourself from violence if you learn how to hit back. Now, the point is that first thing to recognize is that the violence is a structural, systemic violence that emanates right from the family to the workplace. And one dent in this was made through the popularization and through the UGC recommendation in the Towards Equality Committee report that every university should have a women's studies department. And this women's studies department should basically be integrated into the larger education system. Unfortunately, what has happened is women's studies has remained women's studies. I can tell you, even in a university like JNU, the women and work course that I teach, I don't think that there's a second course in the university. In a university where a lot of people, there are a lot of feminists and a lot of people write on women's issues. Secondly, the integration of gender equal values in the course. And you see, we need to revise our course structure. We cannot say that the course structure should remain as it was 40 years ago, 50 years ago. We need to revise our course structure. But that course structure needs to be revised in a manner that makes us sensitive to issues regarding women, minorities, historically deprived people, anti-caste movements, everything. That orientation is gone because the political leadership of this country is not interested in that anymore. So it has to become the agenda of the democratic movement. Now, how can we address this? There are two ways. One is by keeping alive the women's studies program and making it a democratic program. You know that under the current scheme, even gender studies is a very threatened subject. It's a threatened subject. There could be no regularization. Many of the departments are actually being shut down. In fact, the EDWA itself has been part of an alliance which is basically now being formed to protect gender studies. So that's one. The second thing I always feel is that, instead of vocationalizing education as a separate thing, it is an aspect, field work, and that is an aspect that should be integrated into our coursework itself. So, student projects which are part of the coursework should be initiated. But what we find even in a place like JNU is that when I wanted to take several of my students to Maharashtra for field work, there's no public funding for it. So what has happened is that it's become a projectized mode. Education has become a projectized mode, and this can only be reversed if there is public funding for social sciences, where the social sciences become compulsory even for science students to learn, where it's not a mishmash, but a science student has to take gender studies and other things. So as I said, we're not against flexibility. We've been promoting flexibility, but we are not against dismantling, but we are against dismantling public education and public financing in the name of flexibility. Unless that is done, the only response to women's security is going to be self-defense, and the only money that you're going to get for gender studies is for promoting self-defense programs. So the mindset can only be changed. Now, the point is that if the government is not going to do that, the movements have to link up with the colleges and the universities and provide that backup and space where students can be exposed to how gender is actually working, can be exposed to rural life or even disadvantaged urban life. Unfortunately, this thing is possible in flexibility in Europe, but it's not being promoted in flexibility in India. So that is not the kind of flexibility that is being introduced. Flexibility is not being introduced to widen your perspective. Flexibility is being introduced to reduce the number of years of education. That's the point that I'm trying to make, and there are no easy answers for what Swapna has asked. Now, Gender Inclusion Fund. You see, if you look at Gender Inclusion Fund, in the Kasturi Rangan Committee report, which was a draft 2019 thing, it said that money will be given for specific projects proposed by state governments for gender inclusion. So this is the first method by which you disinvest, is by projectizing. Secondly, it said that the central government will decide what is gender inclusion. So that itself is a very this thing. Thirdly, it said that the fund will be a fund of philanthropy with great private participation and with no commitment for expansion of public finance into education. This is true of the entire financing policy of within the national education policy. Yeah, so with that, I take up the other issue of finance, which is that how do you fund? There are many methods of expanding public funding. You expand public funding by taxing the rich. You expand public fund by recovering loans from the non-performing assets. I think there are estimates that have shown that these are things that should be done and the money is available. If the money was not available, we would talk about some alternative funding. Money is available, but the political will, so that's what we are struggling for. The political will to recover the money, and instead you're talking about student loans and all this. When people don't have jobs, how are they going to repay loans? It's a ridiculous idea in this country when the crisis of the economy, the education policy cannot be seen in a vacuum. So that's one thing. And how can you fund? You can make education cheaper by nationalizing private institutions and recovering loan, tax evasions, power dues, NPAs. Yeah, you can put 2% tax on corporate profits for education. I think it was in the EDWA memorandum also, this what we had made. 2% tax on corporate profits. So that the education cess is not levied on all and sundry. The education cess on corporate profit should maybe even be more than that. After all, it's creating the future of the nation. You can do that. There are several methods. There can be debates about these methods. But we should not be helpless that there's no money. The money is there, the government is deciding not to use it. Why does it? The government is spoiling its relations with its neighbors and increasing the military budget. Make peace with your neighbors and reduce the military budget. There are so many different anti-imperialist ways of financing education, of financing education. So 6% is acceptable, but the 6% commitment should be of public education, central government and state governments, not together a hodgepodge commitment. So this is no commitment at all actually, because you have not made a budgetary provision or an instrument for a budgetary provision under this policy. Now, I totally agree with this, that by ignoring the gains of modern education in this country and of modern democratic education in this country, we are really sort of turning the clock back, which again brings me to my proposition that the ruling class and the state as it exists now is not interested in educating people. It's interested in having subjects who it can discipline, who don't think, because if you think, you go to jail. If you think, you go to jail. So regarding skill, I've actually already explained this, but I can explain it again. Skills without jobs is basically a method of making skilled labor more cheap. You're creating a reserve army of skilled labor for the corporate sector. So I'm not per se against, enskilling women, but women are anyway being pushed out of jobs. You're going to provide them skills for what? Their joblessness is not because they don't have skills. Their joblessness is because there are no jobs. Because manufacturing is packed up, service sector is now packing up, informal sector is now packing up. So you're providing skills for whom? Because skills are not increasing. Skills can increase your thinking capacity only if you look at it like that. When you're not looking at it like that, it's not increasing your thinking capacity. And now demands, I just want to make one or two things about demands. I think common school system, neighborhood system with uniform quality is what we have been demanding, and this is absolutely crucial for an educated female population at least. We've been demanding that. Neighborhood child care and preschool education is what we've been demanding, and the upgradation of Anganwadis into a neighborhood nutrition and child care preschool system. But it should be neighborhood. It should be somewhere where women can go, leave their children, go to work, come in the evening and pick up their children and ensure that they are given good nutrition, creative learning, and all these things. This is not what your preschool education, which is being included now, is going to do. It's saying that it should be linked to a school. This is going to really constrict women workers. So you can keep inskilling them, but you're going to put them in a position where they're going to be staying at home. So there are several demands that we have made, and maybe Bindu can share them with you, several positive demands that we have made in this regard, and maybe Bindu can share them with you later. But I feel that the demand for a common school system strengthening rather than diluting RTE. And one more thing I want to say, that gender is going to be out of your research priorities, because now the government is saying only issues of national priority can be researched and everything else will be projectized. So there's going to be no public money for research. And we know from America, the American model, that when corporations give money, they also control what research you do. So I don't see much hope for gender research in this kind of a situation. So we have to continue to struggle. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Archana. Let me wind up the discussion. Any more? Any more questions? Any more questions? Yeah. So let us wind up. I will summarize the points. The document, as we have seen, is the progeny of crony capitalism and majority communalism. And it undertakes a kind of systemic violence, as she has pointed out. Education is not a space for creating reserve armies for corporates and communal forces. An attitudinal change is necessary. Mindset should be changed. The gender gap has increased after 2014. It's not an accident. It is part of the project of strengthening hierarchies and inequalities. It is very vital for us to fight against such reactionary and conservative streams which relegate women to the margins, which may oust us from both education and employment. The government intervention, control, regulation, and public funding are necessary to ensure women's participation and empowerment related to education. Continuous struggles are to be fought for ensuring gender justice. Public funding and freedom associated with this are necessary for that. We have to free the sector of education from constricted commercial values and communal ethos. This is our present mission as AKP-CTA activists. My humble request to the delegates who are here is to continue their struggle against these reactionary, conservative, and market-ended values. With these words, I conclude and I call upon Dr. Emmanuel Tom, Member Academic Committee, to pay a vote of thanks. Dr. Emmanuel Tom.
Hello, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Honorable Chair, our resource person for the day, Dr. Archana Prasad, Professor, Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies, JNU, New Delhi, and other dignitaries and delegates. Good evening to all. We have reached the final session of today's webinar on women, equality, and education. The National Lecture Series on NEP was planned by the Academic Committee of AKP-CTA to uncover the broad philosophical and also the custom and particular issues that the policy contains or which the policy fails to address. Today, we had our fourth lecture of the lecture series on the topic Women, Equality and Education. On behalf of AKP-CTA, its entire fraternity and the organizing committee, I take this opportunity to thank and to express our sincere gratitude to our eminent speaker of the session, Dr. Archana Prasad, who spared the time from her busy schedule to grace this webinar with her extremely relevant address on women, equality, and education in connection with NEP. Thank you, ma'am, for spending your valuable time with AKP-CTA and for sharing your valuable thoughts. Thank you once again, ma'am. On behalf